we begin our talk, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the people who are now senior elders of the Kulin Nations for their support for me in my learning and teaching on the lands of the Kulin Nations over the last 32 years. Well, I think my personal journey as an educator is very much caught up in my own journey to reclaim my Indigenous identity as a Yorta Yorta woman. I was largely raised outside the Aboriginal community, and when I was in my late 20s I was actually asked to teach with the Aboriginal childcare course in Collingwood. And as a kindergarten teacher I found that really daunting because I hadn't taught adults before, and some of these students were as young as 16, and that was going to be a challenge as well. Yeah. But the most challenging part of it was my own ignorance about my Aboriginality. What I was taught in my own education was very stereotypical and racist, and because I hadn't had much contact with my own family, I hadn't learnt much about my own culture. But it wasn't until I started teaching at the Aboriginal childcare course where my ideas were really challenged. And I was very lucky. Some of the elders who were associated with the course actually took me under their wing and gave me an education about culture and identity and history, and I was really privileged to be able to listen to them talk about their own experiences of mission life, and also some of the stories that their elders had passed on to them, they passed on to me. So most people I came into contact with when I was learning were very patient with me and very gentle. So I'm really grateful for those elders who were kind enough and patient enough to take me through that learning process, which started in the 80s. I think the concept and the practice of self-determination became really much clearer to me as my education advanced, that teaching is actually an act, a political act. Yeah. And self-determination is about power, and it's about empowering our Indigenous children, and it's about empowering our parents and communities who have the right to direct the education of their own Indigenous children, and also to direct the education that all children have around Indigenous culture, history and identity. Auntie Iris Lovett Gardner, who's now passed on, she was probably one of the first elders I met. She was connected with the course, and she was a role model too for me, as well as learning about culture. I could see that she'd been very strong throughout her life and advocated for Indigenous rights. Then my academic study too sort of layered on top of that and melded with it. The major thing that came out of the research is that there was a need for a reconceptualization of Aboriginality in the early childhood space. I found that there was still a lot of, the research is quite old, I might qualify that now. I finished it in 2009 and started about 2000. During that time there was still a lot of people who were holding these sort of stereotypical bigoted views about Aboriginality, and we felt that people needed to really deconstruct that. Yeah. And think about things like binaries, black, white, traditional, assimilated, contemporary, isolated communities, and have a look at the complexities around Aboriginality that people weren't seeing, that we sometimes referred to as the excluded middle. Since I've written that, I have seen a shift, and especially a shift since I started teaching kindergarten many years ago. People are much more aware of the complexities around Aboriginal cultures in Victoria, and I think they're much more aware of the social justice implications that education has when you're embedding Indigenous perspectives in your curriculum, what that actually means. I learned a lot again from my thesis and talking about the experience of parents. And some of these parents I sort of talk about as gentle decolonisers, because they're trying to turn around what's happening in the centres that their children are attending, because most of our kids still go to mainstream services, and the parents are going in and seeing representations or processes they don't agree with. So they're going in and saying, no, we think this is inappropriate. I think you should be trying this approach. About 6 years ago, Annette Sachs and I, Annette's a Tanarong woman, she's well known in the early childhood community, we decided we'd start a group called APEC, which is Action on Aboriginal Perspectives in Early Childhood. It's National Aboriginal and Islanders Children's Day, a national celebration of culture and awareness raising. And one of our elders came and spoke about possumskins and how there's been a revival and revitalisation around using possum skins as part of culture and ceremony, and how Indigenous children learn through possum skin cloaks in particular. And one of the practitioners who was in the audience said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could share that knowledge right across Victoria with all children? So we actually got some funding and we put together a document called the Possum Skin Pedagogy. So the narrative of journey and healing, for example, tradition, loss, survival and regeneration. The narrative of ceremony and spirituality, with emphasis on the ceremonial place of skins in Aboriginal communities, such as the place of skins in Welcome to Country, in births and deaths. The narrative of Aboriginal literacy, how children learnt the meaning of symbols through storytelling. The narrative of nature, connections to country, how our people got everything they needed from the land. The narrative of family, as in the catching and uses of possum skins and the role of men, women and children in this. The narrative of science and technology, continuity and change, for example, the use of tools in the construction of possum skins cloaks past and present. And the narrative of recreation, how Aboriginal children and adults constructed games for sport and education. So the first three of those narratives, because they contain sensitive or spiritual content, we've recommended that people have to have input from an elder or some other person in the Indigenous community who holds that sort of knowledge. We talk about pedagogy. Yeah. I think that storytelling is really important as part of Indigenous pedagogy. For me, it made the invisible visible in a very powerful and intimate way. When I was doing my thesis, I got a lot more insight into Indigenous pedagogy because I was talking to the elders. I interviewed about 40 people together and we had really long conversations. Indigenous early childhood practitioners, parents, 2, 3, 4-year-olds, and also some non-Indigenous practitioners who are active in the field of embedding Indigenous perspectives in their programs. And some of the things that they talked to me about was learning about the natural world, learning about their clan group, learning respect for the elders, learning their language, and learning about their traditional land. Acknowledging that there is a strong Indigenous community in Melbourne is a really important point that I think some people are yet to make. Even if you are fair-skinned and you say you're Indigenous, listen. Yeah. That's who I am. I'm telling you that's who I am. Don't say no. We still have some way to go with challenging those sort of biases and stereotypes that people have grown up with. So people really, I think, need to reflect on their own understandings, either to move forward with the community around them. Teachers need to take the position of learner in a lot of this and give up some of that power and say, well, I don't know and I need to ask permission before I move forward. But there are a lot of things in the public domain that they can get. Books, puppets, songs, like Auntie Wendy's Mob, her CD, have been approved by communities for use. So I think some of those pedagogies that are taught and used in Indigenous specific places also can be used in the mainstream centres. Protocols that need to be observed. People may have old storybooks in their shelves. Are they written by an Indigenous person or in consultation with an Indigenous person? There are still some books floating out there that are quite disrespectful because they're stealing people's stories and relabelling them as their own. So I think people need to review some of their books and resources to make sure they are respectful. And stories, are they being used with respect? Like Auntie Joy Murphy, she's a senior Wurundjeri elder. She's written this gorgeous book. I think when using a book like this, it's important to share that these words are Auntie Joy's, not the readers. Yeah. And that, she is the one using her language to welcome us onto country. It's not the person who's reading the book. One of the real differences between, call it Western pedagogy, will we? Yeah. And Indigenous pedagogy is a position of elders as knowledge holders. Yeah. I think probably the position of elders as teachers isn't as prominent in some Western communities. So knowing that you need to consult with someone before doing particular things, I think that might be quite alien to some practitioners, that you can't just do what you think is appropriate. There are times when you need to actually contact someone and say, is this appropriate? Is this respectful? So making those community connections is really important. It's not always easy. I think that's something too that practitioners need to exercise patience, because our elders have got huge responsibilities within their own communities, locally, even internationally. So if you don't hear anything the first time, try again, try and make contact with maybe your co-op or VAI or your local Aboriginal educator. Perhaps even write an email or a letter saying, this is what we're doing. I just want to let you know this is what we're doing in our centre. So it could be a process that could take years. So I think being patient and understanding that people have huge commitments. I mean, there's probably a small number of elders and a huge number of centres. So I think having that understanding is really important, and not giving up. Yeah. Because you can use things like these sort of things that have been authored by Indigenous people that have been given to you to say, yes, you can share this, as long as put it in this sort of respectful framework. Listen to what people are saying. If they're saying, yes, I am Indigenous and so is my child, they need to suspend those stereotypes that they've probably still got in their minds and actually listen to what the person's saying about themselves. So, for example, you could say, you know, I noticed you ticked this box on the form. How can we best embed your child's culture in our program and we, you know, be guided by you and form some partnerships with you and community to do this? Parents have said that they like to see a program that's ongoing. I mean, a lot of people do things around NAIDOC Week or Reconciliation Week, and the parents were saying they think that's fabulous, that should be real highlights, yeah. But they can be tokenistic because if that's all that's done, yeah. It's not an authentic embedding of perspectives into the program. It should be something that happens all the time. And they also wanted their children's lives reflected in the program. So the children would see images of themselves, not images of people perhaps from the Northern Territory or somewhere like that. I know people can be quite anxious about all this and that can stop people from doing things, but there are a lot of resources that are appropriate to use. And I think if you turn your anxiety around and using it to be reflective and perhaps critical of your own practice, I think that could be a positive thing. Like going back and looking at your own centre philosophy, I think that's a good place to start. Why am I doing this? Why is it important? Is it about social justice? What do I know about the country that my early childhood centre is on? What is the history of the people who live here? And talking about it in the present tense, one of the practitioners said, oh, I need to start talking about this as now, not as then. So people are becoming slightly more aware that there is a vibrant, strong community here that has survived dispossession, and that needs to be recognised.